"I did suggest," said Lily, "that we may suppose a castration motive in the insult, a desire to degrade and humiliate the male rival, which would of course be finally identifiable with the relevant stage of infantile fixation and the accompanying phobias." I flexed muscles, rubbed my legs together, forced myself to stay sane, to deduce what reason I could get out of all this unreason. I could not believe that they were psychologists. They would never risk giving me their names. On the other hand, they must be brilliant at improvising the right jargon, since my gesture had come without warning. Or had it? I thought fast. They had needed my gesture to cue their dialogue, and it happened to be one that I hadn't used for years. But I remembered having heard that one could make people do things after hypnosis on a pre-suggested signal. It would have been easy. When I was clapped, I felt forced to give the sign. I must be on my guard, do nothing without thinking. The old man quietened further discussion. "Mr. Orff, your significant gesture brings me to our purpose in all meeting you here. We are naturally aware that you are filled with deep feelings of anger and hatred toward at least some of us. Some of the repressed material we have discovered reveals a different state of affairs. But as my colleague Dr. Harrison would say, it is what we believe we live with that chiefly concerns us. We have therefore gathered here today to allow you to judge us in your turn. This is why we have placed you in the judge's seat. We have silenced you because justice should be mute until the time for sentencing comes. But before we hear your judgment on us, you must permit us to give some additional evidence against ourselves. Our real justification is scientific, but we are all agreed, as I explained, that the requirements of good clinical practice forbid us to make such an excuse. I now call on Dr. Magus to read out that part of our report on you, which deals with you not as a subject for experiment, but as an ordinary human being. Dr. Magus." The woman from Edinburgh got up. She was about 50, with graying hair cut boyishly short, no lipstick, a hard, intelligent, quasi-lesbian face that looked as if it had singularly little patience with fools. She began to read in a belligerent, transatlantic monotone. "The subject of our 1953 experiment belongs to a familiar category of semi-intellectual introversion. Although excellent for our purposes, his personality pattern is without subsidiary interest. The most significant feature of his lifestyle is negative, its lack of social content. The motives for this attitude springs from an only partly resolved Oedipal complex. The subject shows characteristic symptoms of mingled fear and resentment of authority, especially male authority, and the usual accompanying basic syndrome, an ambivalent attitude toward women, in which they are seen both as desired objects and as objects which have betrayed him, and therefore merit his revenge and counter-betrayal. Time has not allowed us to investigate the subject's specific womb and breast separation traumas, but the compensatory mechanisms he had evolved are so frequent among so-called intellectuals that we may posit with certainty a troubled period of separation from the maternal breast, possibly due to the exigencies of the military career of the subject's father, and a very early identification of the father, or male, as separator, a role which Dr. Conchis adopted in our experiment. The subject has then never been able to accept the initial loss of oral gratification and maternal protection, and this has given him his autoerotic approach to emotional problems and life in general. The subject also conforms to the Adlerian descriptions of siblingless personality traits. The subject has preyed sexually and emotionally on a number of young women. His method, according to Dr. Maxwell, is to stress and exhibit his loneliness and unhappiness, in short, to play the little boy in search of the lost mother. He thereby arouses repressed maternal instincts in his victims, which he then proceeds to exploit with the semi-incestuous ruthlessness of this type. In the usual way, the subject identifies God with the father figure, aggressively rejecting any belief in him. He has career-wise continually placed himself in situations of isolation. His solution of his fundamental separation anxiety requires him to cast himself as the rebel and outsider. His unconscious intention in seeking this isolation is to find a justification for his preying on women and also for his withdrawal from any community orientated in directions hostile to his fundamental needs of self-gratification. The subject's family, caste, and national background have not helped in the resolution of his problems. He comes of a military family in which there were a large number of taboos resulting from a strongly authoritarian paternal regime. His caste in his own country, that of the professional middle class, Zviman's techno-bourgeoisie, is of course marked by an obsessional adherence to such regimes. In a remark to Dr. Maxwell, the subject reported that all through my adolescence I had to lead two lives. This is a good layman's description of environment-motivated and finally consciously induced paraschizophrenia, madness as lubricant, in Karen Horney's famous phrase. On leaving university, the subject put himself in the one environment he would not be able to tolerate, that of an expensive private school, the social transmitter of all those paternalistic and authoritarian traits the subject hates. Predictably, he then felt himself forced both out of the school and out of his country, and adopted the role of expatriate, though he ensured himself against any valid adjustment by once again choosing an environment, the school on Fraxos, which was certain to provide him with the required elements of hostility. His work there is academically barely adequate, and his relationship with his colleagues and students poor. To sum up, he is behaviorally the victim of a repetition compulsion that he has failed to understand. In every environment, he looks for those elements that allow him to feel isolated, that allow him to justify his withdrawal from meaningful social responsibilities and relationships and his consequent regression into the infantile state of frustrated self-gratification. At present, this autistic regression takes the form mentioned above, of affairs with young women. Although previous attempts at an artistic resolution have apparently failed, we may predict that further such attempts will be made and that there will be the normal cultural life pattern of the type: excessive respect for iconoclastic avant-garde art, contempt for tradition, paranosic sympathy with fellow rebels and nonconformers in conflict with frequent and depressive and persecutory phases in personal and work relationships. As Dr. Conchis has observed in his The Mid-Century Predicament, the rebel with no specific gift for rebellion is destined to become the drone, and even this metaphor is inexact, since the drone has at least a small chance of fecundating the queen, whereas the human rebel drone is deprived even of that small chance, and may finally see himself as totally sterile, lacking not only the brilliant life success of the queens, but even the humble satisfactions of the workers in the human hive. Such a personality is reduced to mere wax, a mere receiver of impressions, and this condition is the very negation of the basic drive in him to rebel. It is no wonder that in middle age many such failed rebels turned self-conscious drones, aware of their susceptibility to intellectual vogues, adopt a mask of cynicism that cannot hide their more or less paranoid sense of having been betrayed by life. While she had been speaking, the others at the table listened in their various ways, some looking at her, others sunk in contemplation of the table. Lily was one of the most attentive. The students scribbled notes. I spent all my time staring at the woman who read and never once looked at me. I felt full of spleen, of hatred of all of them. There was some truth in what she was saying, but I knew nothing could justify such a public analysis, even if it were true. Just as nothing could justify Lily's behavior, because most of the material this analysis was based on must have come from her. I stared at her, but she would not look up. I knew who had written the report. There were too many echoes of Conchis. I was not misled by the new mask. He was still the master of ceremonies, the man behind it all at Webb Center. The American woman sipped water from a glass. There was silence. Evidently, the report was not finished. She began to read on. There are 2 appendices or footnotes. One comes from Professor Ciardi and is as follows. I dissent from the view that the subject is without significance outside the matter of our experiment. In my view, one may anticipate in 20 years' time a period of considerable and today almost unimaginable prosperity in the West. I repeat my assertion that the threat of a nuclear catastrophe will have a healthy effect on Western Europe and America. It will firstly stimulate economic production. It will secondly ensure that there is peace. It will thirdly provide a constant sense of real danger behind every moment of living, which was, in my opinion, missing before the last war, and so contributed to it. Although this threat of war may do something to counteract the otherwise dominating role that the female sex must play in a peacetime society dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure, I predict that breast-fixated men like the subject will become the norm. We are entering an amoral and permissive era in which self-gratification in the form of high wages and a wide range of consumer goods obtained and obtainable against a background of apparently imminent universal doom will be available, if not to all, then to an increasingly large majority. In such an age, the characteristic personality type must inevitably become autoerotic and clinically autopsychotic. Such a person will be, for economic reasons, isolated, as for personal ones the subject is today from direct contact with the evils of human life, such as starvation, poverty, inadequate living conditions, and the rest. Western Homo sapiens will become Homo solitarius. Though I have little sympathy as a fellow human being for the subject, his predicament interests me as a social psychologist, since he has developed precisely as I would expect a man of moderate intelligence but little analytical power and virtually no science to develop in our age. If nothing else, he proves the total inadequacy of the confused value judgments and pseudo-statements of art to equip modern man for his evolutionary role. The woman laid down the paper and picked up another. This second note comes from Dr. Maxwell, who of course has had the closest personal contact with the subject. She says, in my view, the subject's selfishness and social inadequacy have been determined by his past, and any report which we communicate to him should make it clear that his personality deficiencies are due to circumstances outside his command. The subject may not understand that we are making clinical descriptions, and not, at least in my own case, with any association of moral blame. If anything, our attitude should be one of pity toward a personality that has to cover its deficiencies under so many conscious and unconscious lies. We must always remember that the subject has been launched into the world with no training in self-analysis and self-orientation, and that almost all the education he has received is positively harmful to him. He was, so to speak, born short-sighted by nature and has been further blinded by his environments. It is small wonder that he cannot find his way. The American woman sat down. The old man in the white beard nodded, as if pleased with what had been said. He looked at me, then at Lily. I think, Dr. Maxwell, that it would be fair to the subject if you repeated what you said to me last night in connection with him. Lily bowed her head, then stood up and spoke to the others. She glanced at me briefly, as if I was a diagram on a blackboard. During my relationship with the subject, I experienced a certain degree of countertransference. I have analyzed this with the help of Dr. Marcus, and we think that this emotional attachment can be broken into 2 components. One originated in a physical attraction for him, artificially exaggerated by the role I had to play. The second component was empathetic in nature. The subject's self-pity is projected so strongly on his environment that one becomes contaminated by it. I thought this was of interest in view of Professor Ciardi's comment. The old man nodded. Thank you. She sat down. He looked up at me. All this may seem cruel to you, but we wish to hide nothing. He looked at Lily. As regards the first component of your attachment, sexual attraction, would you describe to the subject and to us your present feelings? I consider that the subject would make a very inadequate husband, except as a sexual partner. Ice cold, she looked at me, then back to the old man. I had a dreadful, lancing memory of her standing against me, the night, the rain, the slow caress. Dr. Marcus intervened. He has basic marriage-destructive drives? Yes. Specifically? Infidelity, selfishness, inconsiderateness in everyday routines? Possibly homosexual tendencies. The old man. Would the situation be altered if he had analysis? In my opinion, no. The old man turned. Maurice? Conchi spoke, staring at me. I think we are all agreed that he has been an admirable subject for our purposes, but he has masochistic traits that will get pleasure even out of our discussion of his faults. In my opinion, our further interest in him is now both harmful to him and unnecessary. The old man looked up at me. Under narcosis, it was discovered that you are still strongly attracted to Dr. Maxwell. Some of us have also been concerned about the effect that the loss of the young Australian girl, for which, I must also tell you, you feel deeply guilty in your unconscious, and now the second loss of the mythical figure you know as Julie, may have on you. I refer to the possibility of suicide. Our conclusion has been this, that your attachment to self-gratification is too deep to make any other than a hysterical attempt at suicide likely, and against this we advise you to guard. I gave a sarcastic bow of thanks. Dignity keeps some remnant of dignity. Now, does anyone wish to say anything more? He looked both ways down the table. They all shook their heads. Very well, we have come to the end of our experiment. He gestured for the board to stand, which they did. The audience remained sitting. He looked at me. We have not concealed our real opinion of you, and since this is a trial, we have, of course, been acting as witnesses against ourselves. You are, I remind you, once again, the judge, and the time has now come for you to judge us. We have, first of all, selected a pharmakos, a scapegoat. He looked to his left. Lily took off her glasses, stepped round the table, and came and stood at the foot of the dais in front of me, with a bowed head, the white woolen dress, a penitential. Even then I was so stupid that I saw some fantastic new development, a mock wedding, some absurd happy ending, and I thought grimly what I would do if they dared try that on. She is your prisoner, but you cannot do what you like with her, because the code of medical justice under which we exist specifies a precise type of punishment for the crime of destroying all power of forgiveness in the subject of our experiments. He turned round to Adam, who stood near the archway. The apparatus. Adam called something. The other people behind the table stood to one side in a compact group facing the students, with the old man at their head. 4 black-uniformed men came in. They quickly moved the sedan coffin and 2 of the tables, so that the center of the room was left free. The 3rd table was lifted in front of me, beside Lily. Then 2 of the men left, and returned carrying a heavy wooden frame, like a door frame on bracketed legs. 6 or 7 feet up, at the top of the uprights, were iron rings. Lily turned and walked to where they set it, some halfway down the room. She stood in front of it and held up her arms. Adam handcuffed her wrists to the rings, so that she was crucified against it, with her back to me. Then a kind of stiffened leather helmet with a down-projecting backpiece that covered the nape of her neck was put on her head, a protector. It was a flogging frame. Adam then left, returned in 2 seconds. I could not see what he was holding at first, but he swung it loose as he came toward me, and I understood the incredible last trick they were playing. It was a stiff black handle, ending in a long skein of knotted lashes. Adam unraveled 2 or 3 that were tangled, then laid the foul thing on the table, handle toward me. Then he went back to Lily, everything was carefully planned to be in this sequence, and pulled down the zip in the back of her dress to her waist. He even unhooked her bra, then folded it and the dress carefully aside so that her bare back was fully exposed. I could see the pink lines on her skin where the strap had crossed. I was the Eumenides, the merciless Furies. My hands began to sweat. Once again I was plunged hopelessly out of my depth. Always with conscience one went down, and it seemed one could go no farther. But at the end another way went even lower. The smuts-like old man came forward again and stood in front of me. You see the scapegoat, and you see the instrument of punishment. You are now both judge and executioner. We are all here haters of unnecessary suffering, as you must try to understand when you come to think over these events. But we are all agreed that these must be a point in our experiment when you, the subject, have absolute freedom to choose whether to inflict pain on us, and a pain abhorrent to all of us, in your turn. We have chosen Dr. Maxwell because she best symbolizes what we are to you. Now we ask you to do as the Roman emperors did, and to raise or lower your right thumb. If you lower it, you will be released and free to carry out the punishment as severely and brutally as you wish, up to 10 strokes. That is sufficient to ensure the most atrocious suffering and permanent disfigurement. If you raise your thumb in the sign of mercy, you will, apart from one last short process of disintoxication, be free of us forevermore. You will equally be free if you choose to punish, which will also demonstrate the satisfactory completion of your disintoxication. Now I ask one last thing of you, that you think carefully, very carefully indeed, before you choose. At some unseen signal, the students all rose. Everyone in the room stared at me. I was aware that I wanted to make a right choice, something that would make them all remember me, that would prove them all wrong. I knew I was judge only in name. Like all judges, I was finally the judged, to be judged by my own judgment. I saw at once that the choice they were offering me was absurd. Everything was fixed to make it impossible for me to punish Lily. The only punishment I wanted to inflict on her was to make her cry forgiveness, not cry pain. In any case, I knew that even if I put my thumb down, they would find some way of stopping me. The whole situation, with all its gratuitously sadistic undertones, was a trap, a false dilemma. Even then, through all my seething resentment and anger at being so mercilessly exposed in the village stocks, I had a feeling that was certainly not forgiveness of them, even less gratitude, but a recrudescence of that amazement I had felt so often before, that all this could be mounted just for me. Not without hesitation, thinking, gauging whether I was free to choose, and feeling sure that this was not a preconditioning, I turned my thumb down. The old man stared at me a long moment, then signed to the guards and went back to the group. My wrists were freed. I stood up and rubbed them, then tore the gag off. The tape ripped at the stubble on my chin, and for a moment all I could do was blink foolishly with pain. The guards made no move. I rubbed the skin round my mouth and looked round the room. Silence. They expected me to speak, so I would not speak. I went down the wooden steps and picked up the cat. I had half expected it to be a stage property, but it was surprisingly heavy. The handle, of plated leather over wood, a knop end. The thongs were worn, the knots as hard as bullets. The thing looked old, a genuine Royal Navy antique from the Napoleonic Wars. As I handled it, I calculated. The most likely solution was that they would put the lights out, there would be a scuffle, the 4 men and Adam were by the door, and it would be impossible to escape. Without warning, I picked up the cat and swung it down on the table. A savage hiss. The thrash of the lashes on the deal tabletop sounded like a gun. It made 1 or 2 of the students jump. I saw one of them, a girl, look away. Yet no one moved nearer. I began to walk toward where Lily was. I did not expect to get to her, but I did. Still no one moved. I was suddenly within hitting range, and the nearest person was 30 feet away. I stood as if measuring my distance, with my left foot forward, turned to strike. I even gave the beastly thing a little testing reach, so that the thongs brushed the middle of her back. Her face was hidden by the head protector. I swung the cat back over my shoulder, as if I was going to swing it down with all my force on that white back. I half expected a shout to ring out, to see or hear someone dash for me, but no one moved, and I knew, as they must have known, that it would have been too late. Only a bullet could have stopped me. I looked round, half expecting to see a gun, but the 11, the guards, the students, all stood immobile. I looked back at Lily. There was a very real devil in me, an evil marquis that wanted to strike, to see the wet red wheels traverse the delicate skin, not so much to hurt her as to shock them, to bring them to a sense of the enormity of what they were doing, almost of the enormity of making her risk so much. Anton had said it. Very brave. I knew they must be absolutely certain of my decency, my stupid English decency, in spite of all they had said, all the bandiera they had planted in my self-esteem, absolutely sure that not once in 100,000 years would I bring that cat down. I did bring it down then, but very slowly, as if making sure of my distance again. Then took it back. I tried to determine whether once again I was preconditioned not to do it by conscience, but I knew I had absolute freedom of choice. I could do it if I wanted. Then suddenly I understood. I was not holding a cat in my hand in an underground cistern. I was in a sunlit square 10 years before, and in my hands I held a German submachine gun. And it was not Conscience who was now playing the role of Wimmel. Wimmel was inside me, in my stiffened back-thrown arm, in all my past, above all in what I had done to Allison. The better you understand freedom, the less you possess it. And my freedom, too, was in not striking, whatever the cost, whatever 80 other parts of me must die, whatever the watching eyes might think of me, even though it would seem as though they must have foreseen that I was forgiving them, that I was indoctrinated, their dupe. I lowered the cat, and I could feel tears gathering, tears of rage, tears of frustration. All Conscience's maneuverings had been to bring me to this. All the charades, the psychical, the theatrical, the sexual, the psychological, and I was standing as he had stood before the gorilla, unable to beat his brains out, discovering that there are strange times for the calling in of old debts, and even stranger prices to pay. The group of 11 standing by the wall, standing with the sedan half hidden in their center, as if they were guarding it from me, I saw June, who had the grace not to meet my look. I somehow knew that she was frightened. She, for one, had not been sure. The white back. I walked toward them, toward Conscience. I saw Anton, who was standing beside him, tilt forward infinitesimally. I knew he was getting onto the balls of his feet, ready to spring. Joe was watching me like a hawk, too. I stood in front of Conscience and handed him the cat, handle first. He took it, but he never moved his eyes from mine. We stared at each other for a long moment, that same old stare, simianly observing. He expected me to speak, to say the word, but I would not, could not. I looked round the faces of the group. I knew they were only actors and actresses, but that even the best of their profession cannot, in silence, act certain human qualities, like intelligence, experience, intellectual honesty, and they had their share of that. Nor could they take part in such a scene without more inducement than money, however much money Conscience offered. I sensed a moment of comprehension between all of us, a strange sort of mutual respect, on their side perhaps no more than a relief that I was, as they secretly believed me to be, behind all the mysteries and the humiliations, on my side a dim conviction of having entered some deeper, wiser, esoteric society than I could without danger speak in. As I stood there close to their 11 silences, Their faces without hostility, yet without concession, faces dissociated from my anger, as close, remote, and oblique as the faces in a Flemish adoration. I felt myself almost physically dwindling, as one dwindles before certain works of art, certain truths, seeing one's smallness, narrow-mindedness, insufficiency in their dimension and value. I could see it in Conscius's eyes. Something besides Eleutheria had been proved, and I was the only person there who did not know what it was. I looked for it in his eyes, but that was like looking into the darkest night. 100 things trembled on my lips, in my mind, and died there. No answer, no movement. Abruptly, I went back to the throne. I watched the students go out. I watched Lily being unfastened. June helped her dress, and they rejoined the others. The frame was removed. Finally, only the group of 12 remained. Once again, as drilled as a Sophoclean chorus, they bowed, then turned, and walked out. The men stood aside for the women to lead the way at the arch, and Lily was the first to disappear. But when the last of the men had gone, she came back for a moment in the archway, staring at me as I stared at her, her face without expression, without gratitude, leaving a dozen reasons in the air as to why she might have given me this last glimpse, or herself this last glimpse of me.